So metals and non-metals can actually be defined by the type of ion that they form when they react. So here we got element A and element B. So in element A, when you do a reaction, you form positive ions, and in element B, you get negative ions. Okay, so what we can say is that element A is definitely a metal. So this is a metal, and element B, because it didn't form a positive ion, this is a non-metal, okay? So anything that doesn't react to form positive ions is what we call a non-metal. In this case, we have a negative ion, but you could also just have no ion at all. So anything with a neutron charge as well would also be considered a non-metal, okay? So anything that reacts after the reaction, it forms a positive ion, that by definition is what we call a metal. Okay, so now if you look at the periodic table to look at metals and non-metals, what you'll find is that most of the elements in the periodic table are metals. We'll actually find that most of the metals in the periodic table are found in the bottom left. So generally any of these elements in this general direction are considered to be metals. That actually includes this block over here, which we'll talk about in more detail. And any of the elements towards the top and towards the right hand side of the periodic table, basically anything over here, are what we consider to be non-metals. Okay, so generally we can say these are non-metals and these are metals. And obviously if you want to know specifically for an element, then you look at that element specifically to see if it's a metal or a non-metal. But in terms of the periodic table, we can look at it like that. And we can also actually look at the differences between metals and non-metals. So first of all, let's look at some physical differences. So I think the easiest way to do this is if we do a quick table. So we'll do metals on this side and non-metals on this side. So one thing we can say for a physical difference between a metal and a non-metal is the boiling point and the melting point. So generally metals have a high boiling point and melting point, and we'll use a different color, whereas non-metals seem to be a bit lower. We can also talk about the conductivity. So metals generally tend to be better conductors and non-metals are better insulators. Metals tend to have a high density, and we use the symbol ρ for density, and conversely then non-metals have a lower density. We can say in terms of the appearance, metals tend to be quite shiny when you polish them, whereas non-metals are dull. Even when you polish them, they stay dull. Metals are what we call malleable, and what malleable means is basically you can hammer them into shape, whereas with a non-metal is what we call brittle, and what that means is if you try to hammer it into a different shape, it will just snap or break. We can also talk about the reactions. So this is more on a chemical level now. So what we can say for the chemical differences, metals, they tend to react with non-metals to form positive ions, whereas non-metals reacting with non-metals tend to form molecules. Then we can look at the reaction between a metal or non-metal and when it reacts with a metal. And when it reacts with a metal and a metal actually don't tend to react, so here you wouldn't get a reaction. Whereas a metal and a non-metal, when they react, they tend to react to form negative ions in what we call ionic compounds. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail in the next chapter, but it's just good to know. And last of all then, we can talk about the acid-base properties of metals. And again, we're just going to write this down, but don't worry, we will explain it in a bit more detail later. What we can say is that metal oxides are basic. So when you react metal with oxygen, you get a metal oxide, and that metal oxide is what we call basic. And a base is opposite to an acid. And again, we'll explain that in a bit more detail later. But for now, it is good to know that metal oxides are generally basic, whereas a non-metal oxide tends to be acidic. Okay, so those are just some key differences between metals and non-metals. Those are chemical differences and those are physical differences, and you should be aware of both, as well as generally where they are located in the periodic table. So let's have a go at a few questions now to apply what we've learned. Okay, and a few questions, feel free to pause the video and have a go as usual. So we've got a few reactions here. So anywhere we've got like x plus y goes to equals arrow x plus 9, that is a reaction. So first question, is element x a metal and y? So you can see x plus y goes to an x plus ion, and this is a positive ion. So anything that forms a positive ion in a reaction is a metal. So we say yes, it is a metal, and the reason being that it forms a positive ion in the reaction. Question 2, name 3 physical differences between a metal and a non-metal. So physical differences, if you remember, it could be any of these ones. These are all physical differences. You could say the metal has a high boiling point, whereas a non-metal has a lower boiling point. Same thing for melting point. Metal is more conductive. Non-metals tend to be better insulators. The metal tends to have a higher density. Non-metals tend to have a lower density. Shiny versus dull, and malleable versus brittle. So any of those would be correct. And last one, true or false. A metal plus a metal makes positive ions. Well, this is false. A metal and a metal don't tend to react together. Part B then, a metal and a non-metal react to form positive ions in an ionic compound. So this one is actually true. It does form an ionic compound, and the metal is what forms the positive ions, and the non-metal actually forms negative ions in the ionic compound. So the ionic compound is made up of positive ions and negative ions, but the important thing to remember is the positive ions come from the metal and the negative ions come from the non-metal. Okay, and we'll talk about ionic compounds in a little bit more detail, so that will make more sense. So don't worry too much if you didn't quite get that right. And the last question then, non-metals plus metals react to form positive ions in molecules. So this is wrong. This doesn't make any sense. You can't have ions in molecules. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense overall, and I will see you guys in the next one.